Okay, so today we're going to be asking the question, what is an assemblage? Now, an assemblage is, of course, the key element of assemblage theory, which was spawned by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. It has lots of precedent before and after it, and I'm going to particularly be connecting assemblage theory to Heidegger, especially as his thought appears in Being and Time. But we're basically going to be structuring this where I am introducing certain concepts in ontology and their trends in the history of philosophy that will be useful to our analysis as starting off points to get us oriented towards exactly what an assemblage is, because viewing ontology as assemblage theory is perhaps the best way into conceptually understanding much of the moves that Deleuze and Guattari are going to be making. So first, I'm going to have a little bit of a scripted part just to help keep me on track, and then we'll go into a bit more of a free-form analysis of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, where we'll be going through the Geology of Morals chapter as well as the Postulates of Linguistics chapter, where we will be analyzing some ideas of how to approach concepts as an assemblage. Picture a typical movie scene. A weary traveler, panting amidst the desert, searches desperately for sustenance. Finally, amidst the dry air and sand, quivering beneath the sun, an oasis appears. Merely an illusion. The main character delights in partaking in what he needs most, only to find that the water he's drinking is actually sand. These scenes are irregular in film, but it brings us to the question, what is an illusion exactly? What is the difference between reality and illusion when the latter so often presents itself with such lucidity so as to be entirely undifferentiable from the fortuitous appearance of our every desire in front of our eyes? While at first intuitive, the question becomes all the more concerning when we stumble upon films like The Matrix, where the entirety of humanity can be seamlessly enveloped in a collective simulation of reality, behind which is a sinister plot of exploitation. Films such as this have given one pause when considering the role played by social media, the Super Bowl halftime show, AI, virtual reality systems, and much more. And it seems that the technological formulation of the same question from earlier, when posed in The Matrix, translates the question and all its concerns aptly into a 21st century version. Questions such as these are best answered by ontology, the philosophical study of being or reality, in which the goal is to solve, as Martin Heidegger called it, die Seinsfrage, the question of being. There's a long philosophical history of ontology dating back to our very earliest presocratic philosophers, who introduced all sorts of ontological frameworks to explain reality. For example, Thales' thesis that everything is water, or when Anaximenes determines that air is a god and that it comes to be and is without measure, infinite and always in motion. These are largely treated today as either failed attempts at early natural science or are interpreted metaphorically, such as is the case when Heraclitus states that all things are in exchange for fire and fire for all things, or fire will advance and judge and convict all things, which is often seen as a more metaphorical device for driving at the propensity for change in all things. This interpretation is increasingly feasible when viewed in tandem with other remarks of Heraclitus, such as it is death for souls to become wet, which clearly would be absurd if taken literally and seems to support the notion that to change and move, to be fire, is what makes things be, without which things would cease to be. As philosophy progressed, more systematic approaches to ontology began to be developed, often following the impetus of monism, initiated by the presocratics, in which all that is or exists is explained with reference to an essential substance that makes it up, be it water, air, fire, or later, atoms. As thoughts like this developed, it became increasingly concerning to bridge a seemingly impossible divide. How can I accurately apprehend reality? This may sound like an unnecessarily simple question, but the problematic is best epitomized in René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, in which Descartes tasks himself with the simple, or so he initially imagined, objective of establishing what can be known with utter certainty, and thus serve as a firm foundation for philosophical inquiry. His inquiry goes as follows in the first and second meditation. Surely whatever I had admitted until now as most true I received either from the senses or through the senses. However, I have noticed that the senses are sometimes deceptive, and it is a mark of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once. But perhaps even though the senses do sometimes deceive us when it is a question of very small and distant things, still there are many other matters concerning which one simply cannot doubt, even though they are derived from the very same senses. For example, that I am sitting here next to the fire, wearing my winter dressing gown, that I am holding this sheet of paper in my hands and the light. This would all be well and good, were I not a man who is accustomed to sleeping at night and to experiencing in my dreams the very same things, or now and then even less plausible ones, as these insane people do when they are awake. How often does my evening slumber persuade me of such ordinary things as these, that I am here, clothed in my dressing gown, seated next to the fireplace, when in fact I am lying undressed in bed? But right now my eyes are certainly wide awake when I gaze upon this sheet of paper. This head which I'm shaking is not heavy with sleep. I extend this hand consciously and deliberately, and I feel it. Such things would not be so distinct for someone who is asleep. As if I did not recall having been deceived on other occasions even by similar thoughts in my dreams. As I consider these matters more carefully, I see so plainly that there are no definitive signs by which to distinguish between being awake and being asleep. Descartes here opened up a philosophical path that has proven itself well trodden throughout the centuries concerning the apparent divide between an apprehending subject and that subject's world. It becomes common parlance when considering ontology in such a manner to speak of an inside, the subject's consciousness, and a quote-unquote outside, the world independent of the subject. The really concerning element of this train of thought is that it places a grave problem in front of our faces. How is it that we can be sure of the accuracy of our apprehension of the world or outside? If our knowledge of the world is limited, such that it is only delivered to an individual mind as an object of thought, necessarily entailing the truncation of that information such that it conforms to our senses' abilities, how can this be called sure knowledge at all? Descartes makes the weight of such a concern pertinent by pointing out that the distinction between reality and illusion, the waking/dream world, seems to be impossible to definitively parse. Never fear, Hegel is here, or so he believed. After admittedly skipping past a number of key figures to this discussion, such as Immanuel Kant and George Berkeley, Hegel arrives on the scene to tell us some less than comfortable ideas about reality. Hegel was careful to retain the monist tendency of the presocratics, but combined the static notion of monism with a more mobile sense of dualism and multiplicity and change inherent to reality, not all too dissimilar from Heraclitus. For Hegel, there really are genuinely distinct entities that are not reducible to one another or to some form, a seemingly obvious yet somewhat revolutionary idea at the time in the monist-dominated environment. Hegel readily accepted that in order for something to exist, there must be more than just that one thing. By one thing engaging in a dialectic of recognition with another thing, both could be said to exist insofar as they are different from one another. This is laid out in detail in his infamous master-slave dialectic, a section of his magnum opus, Phenomenology of Spirit, which I won't go into too much detail on because I've already done a lecture going into that passage in great detail. Suffice it to say that Hegel found difference integral to ontology. We look around and we perceive a number of different objects and sensations, and to reduce all these things to one substance would make ontology impossible, even on Hegel's standards, precisely because, by making everything a self-same substance, a unitary world order, it would be impossible for anything to be, since to be requires genuine difference in order for recognition to occur, and for entities to have enduring existence. However, Hegel cheekily cuts off this body at its ankles by elaborating that, well, all of reality is aimed toward the systematic and reason-driven resolving or sublation of all these differences, and realizing that everything is Geist, or spirit. Now, it must be specified that Hegel is not saying that everything is spirit as in everything is one big soul, but rather he means this in the loosest possible sense, such as when we speak of the spirit of the times, that unifying essence that defines something in its uniqueness. For Hegel, there's difference right now, but history will dialectically unfold itself as contradictions are resolved with one another, leading to the historical unfolding of the final and absolute ontological state of absolute spirit. It can be clearly gleaned from all that has been said where it was that Marx developed his thought from, and it's important to note the importance of history in Hegel's thoughts. For Hegel, reason was the driving force that propelled difference to be sublated or overcame in a process that would eventually culminate in the realization of a monistic ontology of Geist everywhere. Hegel makes a number of blunders, a big one of which is that Hegel reduces all difference into an instrumental difference that will eventually go away when absolute spirit is eventually realized, in the literal sense of being made real. Leading us to ask, if difference is so integral to ontology as laid out in the master-slave dialectic, can we, even on Hegel's terms, posit this monistic image of reality as something actually ontologically tenable or possible? More importantly for us is Hegel's emphasis on idealism. Hegel internalized a very important point that I mentioned previously when discussing Descartes' dream problematic. The world, quote-unquote, outside the mind is only apprehended as an object of thought, which is to say, as a phenomenological state, hence the phenomenology of spirit getting its name. Hegel, admittedly rather ingeniously, considers just because the world is only known to me as a phenomenological state, does that therefore entail that the world doesn't exist? Descartes explains that the world is only received either from the senses or through the senses. And this gives him grounds for doubting it, since the senses aren't always accurate or correct. But Hegel wonders, I cannot doubt the reality of the world as a phenomenological state. What is meant here is that while we can doubt that there is an object identical to the way it appears as an object of thought in the outside world, we cannot doubt that object as an object of thought, as it exists as a phenomenological state. Hegel considers that if there's no way of bridging the gap between the apprehending, thinking subject and the world outside, since this divide will always be upheld due to the limitations of the senses, it can still be sensible to speak of the world, not as an independent entity which is different from the subject, but as an object of thought of the subjects. Thus, we are brought to the philosophical position of idealism, specifically absolute idealism. Idealism as a philosophical idea existed before Hegel, but Hegel's particular version of idealism has been termed absolute idealism, whereby the world exists only as it exists as a phenomenological state in the mind of the subject. And I'll say that again. Idealism is a position whereby the world exists only as a phenomenological state in the mind of the subject. For Hegel, the only way we can talk about reality for certain is as it appears as a phenomenological state. Thus, Hegel simply deduces that reality is only in the mind, and that this historical unfolding of Geist is essentially the unfolding of reality as a notion emanating from consciousness becoming self-consciousness, or essentially self-aware of itself as the absolute totality of reality, sublating its contradictions and recognizing everything as itself. As one may be able to guess, not only is absolute idealism mind-bending and strange, although admittedly quite ingenious, it leads to many contradictions and absurdities. Considering that Hegel, as mentioned several times previously, places genuine difference as an essential element of his ontology, Hegel kind of shoots himself in the foot by reducing the world or reality to merely an object of thought. If this is the case, then there is no genuine difference at all. There is merely this one thing, Geist, and nothing ultimately different from it. It may just appear to be so, and eventually it won't be. Thus, Hegel doesn't actually grasp difference qua difference, but rather difference qua sameness. Or alternatively, he doesn't understand difference as genuine difference, but rather difference in terms of its sameness to Geist. Hegel cannot permit there to be genuine difference between one thing and another, otherwise there would be something that isn't ultimately reducible to Geist, and thus his monism crumbles. This is why referring to Hegel as accepting of multiplicity or difference is a grave misstep and patently false. Hegel only accepts difference as an inferior mode of Geist's absolute nature. This is, as difficult as it may be to realize upon first reading Hegel, properly totalitarian, since Hegel assumes that ontology is essentially a Geist dictatorship, with reason as its scepter of law and order. As such, Hegel's philosophy leaves a number of holes open for future philosophers, clearly visible by the disastrous political implications, with one of these holes being, how can we accept genuine difference or multiplicity without reducing it to its existence as an object of thought or as an emanation of some absolute substance? Enter Martin Heidegger. Heidegger can rightly be seen as one of the first philosophers to begin to dream up the concept of the assemblage, one which wouldn't begin to be fully elaborated until Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari entered the scene and laid out the concept in their two-part series, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, of which here we'll be looking at the second part, A Thousand Plateaus. Heidegger's most important contribution comes from his readiness to essentially flip idealism on its head. Heidegger makes clear that being, capital B being, or big B being as opposed to little b, is something that obviously penetrates all that exists, but in such a way that being is essentially defined by its possibility for being. Heidegger accepts that there is a real world independent of our thoughts about it, a position which is termed, as opposed to idealism, realism. This world is inhabited by a number of beings, small b beings. So there's the difference between big B being is the being which permeates everything, and little b being is individual particular beings. This world is inhabited by a number of beings, all of which can be characterized in their existence by their existential possibilities, which is to say the ways in which they be, to use technically incorrect phraseology, but in a way that's hopefully clear. Thus, Heidegger lays out a number of different types of modes of being, one of which is Dasein, or being there, or their being in English. I think it's best left untranslated. The mode of being that characterizes human existence, and is epitomized by the fact that Dasein in its being has a relationship to that being, a relationship which itself is one of being. Here, Heidegger is simply trying to elaborate what exactly we can know for certain about all the various beings that inhabit the world by explaining how they're oriented towards being. This is something's possibility for being. Heidegger does not want to reduce all the various beings of the world to one essential substance like the monists, but rather wants to understand beings in their functional relationship, in the way that they live, to that which is at the very core of their mode of existence, being, with a big B. As Heidegger says, when we designate this entity with the term Dasein, we are expressing not its what, as if it were a table, house, or tree, but its being. Heidegger situates the various beings in reality in a key way that is different from Hegel, in that, for Hegel, reality is essentially an interior phenomenon. All that is realized as such as Geist in the mind, and the successive unfolding that approaches this final state of absolute spirit is achieved through an exponential expansion of Geist in its complexity and totalizing capabilities. In contrast, Heidegger situates Dasein, a term commonly and tragically equated with Hegel's Geist, as always finding itself in a world that defines its being as a mode of being. It's important to recognize the functionalist nature of mode of being. Heidegger states that Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. It does not signify simply being ontical, however, but rather being in such a way that one has an understanding of being. Which is to say that one's relationship to being is something one already has been placed within, and which one is already ahead of, so to speak. As such, Dasein does not decide its world like Hegel's Geist does, by reducing the world to an object of thought, but rather is decided by its world, which it is already in a relationship with. Alternatively put, Heidegger says, being in the world, in der Welt sein, is a state of Dasein which is necessarily a priori. Thus, Heidegger's real revolution is flipping the fascistic and totalizing impulse of idealism onto its head into a form of realism that locates beings that exist in the world as being constituted in their mode of being by that world which that being is always already in. Heidegger's work opens up a mode of philosophical inquiry that considers entities as members of a world, or as Deleuze and Guattari will like to say, a population. One which is inhabited by more than just one unitary substance, but rather a whole collection of objects, tools, and consciousnesses who are reciprocally related to one another, insofar as their existence is fundamentally tied to a world that structures what being even means. Moving into the work of Deleuze and Guattari, I think there's a really useful definition of the assemblage that happens on page 90 of A Thousand Plateaus, and I'll be quoting from A Thousand Plateaus for the rest of the lecture. They say, there is a primacy of the machinic assemblage of bodies over tools and goods, a primacy of the collective assemblage of enunciation over languages and words. The articulation of the two aspects of the assemblage is affected by the movements of deterritorialization that quantify their forms. That is why a social field is defined less by its conflicts and contradictions than by the lines of flight running through it. An assemblage has neither base nor superstructure, neither deep structure nor superficial structure. It flattens all of its dimensions onto a single plane of consistency, upon which reciprocal presuppositions and mutual insertions play themselves out. And we're seeing here the real in der Welt sein part of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, which is to say that they're moving away from a hierarchicalized view of ontology and flattening it onto one dimension, this plane of consistency that they talk about. And this plane of consistency is going to create strata. And these strata are basically just, think about layers in a geological column. These are strata. They're these kind of horizontal bands. And they form together, and importantly, they don't just keep their horizontal territory, but they cut diagonally into one another, and they're related to each other as a whole assemblage. each strata is both a substructure and a superstructure to the strata above or below it. And its relation to them is defined by essentially being an aggregate of a bunch of small, think of the minerals that make up a geologic column. They're essentially trying to get to a form of ontology where we're opening up our blinders, so to speak, and looking for maximum context and looking at statements as never being innocent, but rather always implying a social field or a world, like Heidegger would say. Because as we talked about with Heidegger, the world is not constructed or decided upon by Dasein or by humans, but rather we humans are constituted by our world. And this goes for everything, not just for humans. Everything else is defined insofar as it is relational. For example, if you drop a Coke can from a plane onto an island of people that have, let's say they've been isolated for thousands of years, like the North Sentinelese or something, and you drop the Coke can down onto the island. It's not so clear that they would use it for exactly the same things we would. Even if we would like to think that the Coke can, you can figure out what you ought to use it for based on what is most apparent in its function, that itself presupposes certain ways of acting with substances. And it's unclear whether or not if we drop this Coke can down, it will be used for drinking, or whether or not it will be used for burning or as a tool of some kind to cut things or as a weapon. And this is the important thing that they're trying to focus on, is they're focusing on the primacy of a machinic assemblage. And the technological language of machines may be a little off-putting, especially like if you read the first pages of Anti-Oedipus, you'll get a lot of the machine fits and starts and all this. But really their machinic language is actually quite nice, because their point is that ontology is essentially productive, that even when strata are built upon and serve as a substratum for another stratum and kind of build up these territories, think like a mountain, the relationship between the lower and upper stratum is always this active relationship whereby everything is being defined by its relationship to other things. And thus, they're really looking for an assemblage of bodies over tools. They don't necessarily want to think of things as simply being tools, but rather as being tools insofar as they have the function to in this particular situation, and maybe you could turn that tool into a weapon or a piece of artwork or whatever in a certain situation. And this is going to define the assemblage by the movements of deterritorialization that quantify their forms. Which is to say, whenever we have a territory, it establishes binaries and it establishes strata and it establishes ways of interacting. For example, in a very large city, you have a significant territory that is established. Not only kind of in space, you have this amount of space being taken up as a territory, but you also have a territory of law. Where does the rule of law extend to? And not only that, but you have territory of cultural practices, which may emanate further out than immediately beyond the city's borders or whatever. And then you also have the rule of standards of interaction. So, for example, how you ought to use certain objects. Think of things like modesty and what exactly modesty means. That is developed by a stratified territory being established around a singularity. And a singularity is an important point that Deleuze and Guattari will use to basically represent a locus around which territory will start to develop. And it will cause things that may have just been deterritorialized, that have found a line of flight or a way out of the current order of things into a new order of things. Because, importantly, you never get out of the order of things. You just make your presence known through these lines of flight. These deterritorializations can become re-territorialized if they become captured by a territory, by a singularity. I mean, think of a black hole that takes things in and establishes this territory. And think about the space between the epicenter of the black hole and the event horizon of the black hole, that point of no return where it's just black. That is kind of the very center of the singularity that pulls things in with the greatest force. And Deleuze and Guattari want to think of ontology in the same way. That there are these threatening impulses that come from, for example, fascism is a big one for them. I mean, Foucault calls anti-Oedipus the anti-fascist way of life, or whatever. And Deleuze and Guattari are trying to focus on these lines of flight, these places where deterritorialization can occur, and that what defines the assemblage, and thus all the members of the assemblage, is not these conflicts or these contradictions. Because for Deleuze and Guattari, these conflicts and contradictions are essentially remaining within the order of things. I mean, think of some strife between Trump and Biden, for example. They would say, well, the media wants you to think that this is some life and death conflict, but really it's staying within a very small Overton window of acceptable political statements, and it's really not going to change things that much. In fact, it's going to tend towards fascism, which we see with Trump, whereby this territory is going to get established, and Trump could be seen as a sort of singularity, a thing around which, you know, he's kind of that fascistic, totalizing form that creates territory around him and establishes, you know, this very strict kind of return of the unitary executive theory, for example, and the power of the president. So Deleuze and Guattari think that these kind of conflicts are not really that crazy of conflicts. They're kind of just apparent conflicts to make one feel like their decisions matter or something like this. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to say, no, those conflicts don't really define an assemblage. What does define an assemblage is those lines of flight, those methods of action that cannot be accounted for in the order of things, that present themselves in interesting ways that necessarily cause the order of things to actually change. And the real question of assemblage theory is precisely to figure out where those lines of flight are. How can one engender genuine newness in the arts, or in politics, or in ethics or philosophy or literature? How can one find those lines of flight? And the way to do that is precisely to look at ontology at an assemblage-wide level. And thus, they abandon this sense of hierarchy, of superstructure and superficial structure and deep structure and base structure, you know, all this. They're not really into that because that's an element of Marxism that they really don't like, precisely because, I mean, it's going to usurp one order of things only to create a more totalizing order of things. Think of like Stalinist Russia, for example, or North Korea today. So instead, they want to focus on this single plane of consistency, basically this ontological realm, which is the real, capital R, real, upon which reciprocal presuppositions and mutual insertions play themselves out. And that reciprocal presupposition is really important, because we see this even in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where the self and that other thing which is not the self both equally require each other to be independent things in order for ontology to really work. That's kind of why I said earlier that difference has to genuinely exist in order for ontology to work. And as such, Deleuze and Guattari don't want to treat one form or one content like it is more fundamental than any others, because ultimately even the most quote-unquote fundamental parts equally require the reciprocal presupposition of a whole world of things which structure how that thing works. For example, the human is not defined in isolation, but requires the reciprocal presupposition of a whole state apparatus of education and law and order and senses of punishment, and also systems of organizing and things like this. And I mean, even the types of work that you have available. These are all things that define what it is to be a human. And this is why there is all this kind of generational differences of, like a boomer saying, oh, you Gen Z people, just it's so easy for y'all. Back in my day, it was so much harder. And for an assemblage theorist, they would say, well, you can't really compare one generation as being better than the others, but you rather have to focus on the material conditions of the situation of, well, because higher education is so much more popular now, the job markets are more saturated, and now getting a college degree is going to do less for you than it would in the 50s and 60s, or the 70s or 80s even. So Deleuze and Guattari are going to push for those sort of ideas in assemblage theory. It's important to note that if we want to view the assemblage properly, we really have to get behind this idea that the individual is the wrong way to look at things. Now, this is not to say that they are some sort of collectivist, like anti-individualist kind of, I don't know how the right wing always likes to put it. But it's less of that than it is of viewing something as only existing in relation to other things. There are always givens that make that thing exist and function as such. And if we really want to understand how can we act, it requires a detailed analysis of the situation, but also the recognizing that we can't abstract things away from these situations. They say there are no individual statements, only statement-producing machinic assemblages. We can no longer even speak of distinct machines, only of types of interpenetrating multiplicities that at any given moment form a single machinic assemblage, the faceless figure of the libido. And libido is an important thing which they're trying to take away some of the Freudian undertones of that, and they want to think of everything as having a libido in the sense of having a drive. In kind of, I know at least in the US, I'm not sure how this is in other English-speaking parts of the world, but the libido is seen as explicitly referring to the sex drive. Even in Freud, it doesn't really work like that, so I think that's just a common parlance issue. But they want to look at the assemblage itself as having a libido or a desire. And not a desire in the sense of the world being some conscious collective entity like some form of pantheism. No. What they're trying to say is that these assemblages are not static, but rather they move. And exactly how they move is defined by these interpenetrating multiplicities. Kind of like when I talked about the strata that penetrate one another horizontally instead of just sticking in their horizontal territory. These sorts of interpenetrations between territories where, things get a little weird and you kind of have to analyze closely, okay, how does this territory interact with this territory? Kind of a geopolitics kind of thing. This is going to help define the direction that the assemblage is taking. Is the assemblage becoming increasingly fascistic? Is it turning into kind of a solar system model where you've got a bunch of objects orbiting around a central singularity point? Or is it going to be rhizomatic and non-hierarchical? And that is probably the closest you will get to any sort of quote-unquote telos in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. They don't think that assemblages are oriented towards some set purpose in advance, but rather that purpose, if we can even use such a word, and I really wouldn't when talking about Deleuze and Guattari, that purpose is defined as being in der Welt sein, as being in the world being, as being defined through its relationship to the other members of the assemblage. And thus, there are no distinct machines in the sense that each little machine, each desiring machine, is a member of a larger machinic assemblage, and these are all really the same thing, not insofar as they're reducible to one another, because they do want to push for genuine difference, but rather they want to say that this process of becoming and changing is integral to all of ontology, and thus understanding it as an assemblage is the way that we can actually figure out, okay, what direction is this becoming oriented towards? Is it getting more centralized, or is it becoming more rhizomatic? And a subtle little addition that may go unlooked if you weren't reading hard enough is they state here on page 37, there are no individual statements. There never are. Every statement is the product of a machinic assemblage, kind of like what we just said. In other words, of collective agents of enunciation. Take collective agents to mean not peoples or societies, but multiplicities. And that's important because when they're talking about being a collective agent of enunciation, I mean, they want to think of everything as enunciating. Even the table enunciates its presence by appearing present as such. Nature enunciates by making its presence felt and by being engaged in a process of becoming. And these collective agents of enunciation, hence why they caveat this a little, is not merely restricted to peoples or societies. It's not a human-wide thing alone, but it is a larger multiplicitous considering of these enunciations. So, for example, in order for a table to exist as such, to enunciate its existence, it's contingent upon the assemblage it's within, considering that the table is only insofar as it is a collective assemblage of enunciation, this machinic engine of collective agents that are involved equiprimordially, to use a Heideggerian term, that you are necessarily implying a whole world of interactions that define what it is to be at any given point. They sometimes use the word milieu as an alternate for assemblage, so I think that's important to note that while you may be able to find some differences, and I haven't really been able to dig deep enough to find many hard and fast rules where the milieu is concretely different from the assemblage. I think they're kind of just different words for a very similar way of looking at ontology. But they want to talk about an associated milieu as basically equivalent to Heidegger's idea of a world, of this associated part of the assemblage which is necessary for any partial object to come about. And if you've watched any of my other lectures, you know that partial objects are going to come about through differential relations, through intensities. And they say, the associated milieu is thus defined by the capture of energy sources, respiration in the most general sense, by the discernment of materials, the sensing of their presence or absence, perception, and by the fabrication or non-fabrication of the corresponding compounds, response, reaction. That there are molecular perceptions, no less than molecular reactions, can be seen in the economy of the cell, and the property of regulatory agents to recognize only one or two kinds of chemicals in a very diverse milieu of exteriority. So the exterior milieu, or the associated milieu, that is orienting a partial object is defined by capture. That's probably a really important one because they have a whole plateau called the apparatus of capture. This is going to have a lot to do with the development of early states. But the associated milieu, or the assemblage, or the world, is defined by basically three overarching ideas, one of which is the capture of energy sources, and they equate this with respiration. I think that's a fine way of talking about it, because essentially everything is respirating, everything is feeding off of other elements in the environment to live. You can literally just think of this as everything that is requires some sustenance. And then they also talk about the discernment of materials, this sensing of presence or absence or perception, that everything that is in the assemblage is essentially defined by being able to discern between different materials, by being able to not consciously discern, but rather able to kind of shift its resonance, so to speak, or respond to the presence or absence of another object or an intensity or something like this. I mean, even think of just on the level of physics, the presence of a proton is going to be defined by the relationship that proton has to electrons and neutrons and protons around it that are going to basically define it contextually. And then finally by the fabrication or non-fabrication of the corresponding compounds. This is the response or reaction. That something has the ability to assemble or enter into a definite relation with the assemblage in order to respond, in order to take that libido or that desire that is present within the assemblage and turn it into something that's actually going to cause motion to occur. And their emphasis on the molecular, because they'll talk about the molecular versus the molar, and the molecular is basically this micro level, whereas the molar is this larger level. They point to the regulatory agents in molecular chemistry and in the cell where they are able to precisely recognize specific compounds over others. Take, for example, an enzyme which has a specific substrate that is going to be able to pair with only substances of a particular shape and size. And thus they have this capture of an energy source. Think about an enzyme. It captures an energy source and changes it either by regulating its processing or something else. So this is that kind of respiration, that taking in things. And then this perception or this discernment of materials. The enzyme does that by recognizing certain materials attaching to it over others. And then also this fabrication of the corresponding compounds, this reaction, whereby in response to a specific stimulus in a specific environment, it's able to thereby respond with some kind of reaction. And they connect this in kind of a funny way with the tick, as in like the ticks that stick to your skin. They say the unforgettable associated world of the tick, defined by its gravitational energy of falling, its olfactory characteristic of perceiving sweat, and its active characteristic of latching on. the tick climbs a branch and drops onto a passing mammal it has recognized by smell, then latches onto its skin, an associated world composed of three factors and no more. Active and perceptive characteristics are themselves something of a double pincer, a double articulation. And that last part is really important because that's essentially just saying that anything that is requires the articulation of something outside it, which it is going to have a binary relationship to, in a sense of kind of one thing and another thing. But they're going to have this active relationship whereby the tick, for example, it has this ability to capture energy, but it also has this ability of perception by being able to perceive through its olfactory senses when there is sweat coming from below, and then it releases its grip and it falls down and latches on to a person. And it has an active relationship to the passing mammal, whereby the tick cannot be said to exist in isolation. Its manner of existence is defined by a number of things, one of which is how is it functioning, how is it interacting. And it is either going to be in a state of awaiting someone to come or actively pursuing when it senses someone has came. So an essential part of what it is to be a tick is to be engaged in this assemblage that is the tick's environment and constantly responding to the stimuli. This is why they talk about earlier the fabrication or non-fabrication of the corresponding compounds, which is to say the relationship to the assemblage, it can be this fabrication of a response, or it can be awaiting a response. And thus the tick cannot be abstracted in its being and what it means to be a tick from its environment, because it is always related to these intensities of, like olfactory intensities of the concentration of sweat particles in the air at any given time that are really defining it in its essence, so to speak. Although essence is really not the right word. Maybe we could just say essence insofar as it is multiplicitous. Now, in the Geology of Morals at one point, they're talking about evolution, and they kind of go a long way through talking about all these different debates in early evolutionary biology around Darwin's time. And one of the things they get to is the importance of evolution's emphasis not on perfect forms, because there is no perfect form in an assemblage, but rather there is a form which best suits its environment, which perfectly sums up how natural selection works. Natural selection is not oriented towards making the master race or the highest being, but rather the being which is most functionally compatible with its environment. And that, for Deleuze and Guattari, is the way that objects come about, is by being population-specific and being contextual. And when talking about codes, and we can think of the genetic code too, they say that there must already be an entire molecular population to be coded, and the effects of the code or a change in the code are evaluated in relation to a more or less molar population, depending on the code's ability to propagate in the milieu or create for itself a new associated milieu within which the modification will be popularizable. Yes, we must always think in terms of packs and multiplicities. A code does or does not take hold because the coded individual belongs to a certain population. The population inhabiting test tubes, a flask full of water, or a mammal's intestine. So there is already always this molecular population to be coded, as they talk about. These are the microphenomena which are a little bit more, I don't know, they're a little bit more active than perhaps the molar phenomena are. This is why Deleuze and Guattari like micropolitics more than macropolitics or molar politics, because in the micro stage, there is very little sense of territory. It's much more chaotic, and there's much more potential to find rhizomatic ways of being. Whereas when we get into molar structures, we are necessarily talking about singularities, and the creation of stratified territory, which comes along with it order, and this order can often be very difficult to affect or topple because it has so much territory built up that to really affect that center of the territory is really quite difficult. To cut through with a line of flight that gets to the center of that territory is rather difficult. But the fact that there is already this molecular population, this is kind of Heidegger when he's talking about the fact that there are already a bunch of beings, small b, in the world. And these beings are yet to have a concrete existence until they come into a relation with a population. Now, of course, it's important, like I said, that fact that there must be a population, that is a pre-ontological characteristic of existence itself. So for something to exist as a molar characteristic, it already requires a bunch of other molar objects and a bunch of molecular objects already. And thus, a code cannot be understood as independent from the entities it codes, but also the entities that it codes affect how the code is, how it is expressed. For example, there are all kinds of genetic things like your propensity for alcoholism. Not only is your propensity for alcoholism determined to an extent genetically, there are certain genetic markers that make one more likely to be an alcoholic, but those markers require being turned on and off by the environment. If you are in an environment where there are lots of alcoholics and you have this genetic marker, it will be more and more likely to express itself. Whereas even if you have this genetic propensity and you're not around an environment where that occurs, it probably won't express itself. And thus we can see a really interesting link between molecular biology and just Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage theory in general, which is that even when something is coded, that thing that is coded affects the code depending on the particular environment. And thus they want to think about packs and multiplicities. And packs can be negative sometimes, because think about becoming a pack animal. This is a way of establishing almost a sort of state apparatus, like the family, or like a lineage of leaders that should be revered or something like this. So sometimes being a pack can be bad, and being a multiplicity is a little bit more, that's a better way of approaching action for Deleuze and Guattari. But, of course, there are still packs. There are places where things will start to aggregate together and form their own little bits of territories and establish packs. Deleuze and Guattari do not like the idea of stable forms or substances, partially because they think that in their ontology, that is not really a tenable way of speaking. Instead, just like we talked about in the part about evolutionary biology, they don't want to think about perfection, but rather functional efficacy, so to speak. They say here on page 53, physical particles and chemical substances cross thresholds of deterritorialization on their own stratum and between strata. These thresholds correspond to more or less stable intermediate states, to more or less transitory valences and existences, to engagements with this or that body, to densities of proximity, to more or less localizable connections. So instead of thinking about perfect forms when we look at objects, for example, this, of course, is not the only way that matter could be organized. For example, a table. The matter that is in that table, that's not the only way that it could be organized. But it is the case that if we go down to the microphysical phenomena and we look at the different molecular connections established between the atoms and between the compounds and materials that make up the table, you will find that these substances are, they're engaged in a Brownian motion at the very smallest level, this kind of random twitching motion that establishes the very rhizomatic base of everything that is. Nevertheless, even though they're following these they're more oriented towards deterritorialization on the molecular scale, on that micro scale, when we zoom out, we see that things aggregate into stable intermediate states. So not perfection is achieved when objects come about, but rather stability, a sense of equilibrium. And this is how organisms work. For example, a cell with a cell wall, like a plant cell. It establishes itself precisely because it has this functional relationship such that everything around it allows it to exist as such. And if the environment around the plant cell changes, maybe the pH or the gradients or concentrations of other substances can change such that that cell will just break apart. It will come out of equilibrium and it will go back into this chaotic state of intermingling with the rest of the flows around it, of liquids or whatever it may be. And that's actually really key because we see there that the cell is almost like a piece of territory. And by the environment changing, there is a threshold of acceptable conditions that any object, such as a cell, can find itself in. And say it's pH, for example, it can exist within a certain range of pH concentration. And these are those thresholds they were talking about. And these thresholds allow for these intermediate states to come about, but outside of these valences and these senses of threshold, the cell will just collapse and it will come back into this much more multiplicitous and much more unpredictable relationship to the flows around it that constitute it, the flows of concentrations of liquid, the flows of air, the flows of whatever it's going to be. Now, the critical thing that is going to establish movement is the play within the assemblage between deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So like with cellular chemistry, for example, there is an active relation to the environment such that if the conditions are favorable, these thresholds of acceptability will open themselves up such that if matter is in a certain position, a metastable state will come about such that territory is allowed to establish itself. A partial object comes about. And Deleuze and Guattari are like, fine, territory is going to establish itself all the time. And in a sense, that's good. And we don't want to get rid of territory so much as we want to understand how exactly it is that that territory came about. So that if there is a certain territory that we want to change, or we want to keep from losing its ability to change by becoming too static and molar, we can figure that out. And that's why they're focused on finding lines of flight and deterritorialization. They say that deterritorialization must be thought of as a perfectly positive power that has degrees and thresholds, epistrata, is always relative, and has reterritorialization as its flip side or complement. An organism that is deterritorialized in relation to the exterior necessarily reterritorializes on its interior milieus. So this is kind of a really great formula for exactly what deterritorialization is and the necessary context that is always going to be implicated in any form of deterritorialization, which is that deterritorialization is a positive power. This is what they mean when they reject this notion of lack. They want to see every dream as productive. It's not a, say you have a dream about a train going into a tunnel. Freud or Lacan would say, well, that's actually talking about the penis of the dad going into the vagina of the mom. And your dream is just a deficient or inferior form of that content that your brain doesn't want to tell you it really wants that. Deleuze and Guattari are like, no, there's not one thing you're always going to want, like mommy and daddy, and to exist in the Oedipal triangle, but rather there is always a positive power, a machinic capability entailed with every partial object. Every dream is productive. It is not an inferior version of some signifier that it is just trying to pretend doesn't exist and fights back, but rather, if you have a dream about wolves, the wolves are wolves. They're not something else, or rather they don't have to be something else, and they will not be reduced to something else. Because of course dreams can mean things other than exactly what that formal content is there. But Deleuze and Guattari want to say, yeah, sometimes a dream can mean something different and sometimes it won't. And we can probably find a way of dream analysis that will be able to be more effective at that. But what we're not going to do is just take out these symbols like mommy or daddy or the phallus and say this is what all dreams are reduced to. So Deleuze and Guattari want to instead say that every instance of content and structure and form or whatever is a positive power that has been allowed to occur in the assemblage. Furthermore, these deterritorializations, like we have just said, they have degrees and thresholds, these epistrata. Think of this as, you have a tuning fork, and a tuning fork has a definite size. Now, the size of the tuning fork and its density and its composition has been designed such that it will resonate at one frequency particularly, say 440 hertz, which is A4 on the piano in the US at least, and several other places too. That tuning fork, when there is a frequency of 440 hertz being played, will vibrate sympathetically and in relationship to the amplitude of the wave that has been propagated onto it. But it will also vibrate at simple mathematical ratios above that frequency. So whenever an A that is 440 hertz is played, the tuning fork will vibrate at 440 hertz. But if you play a frequency of 880 hertz, it will also vibrate to that, even though that's not going to be the most dominant tone. It's not going to be louder than that fundamental A440 that it was designed to resonate with. It still has these we could call them register shifts, so to speak, where it being the tuning fork will vibrate at these relations to its environment in relation to its form. So thus, these epistrata are the other points that the tuning fork will vibrate to. And every deterritorialization is going to have these thresholds after which a register shift will speak or will show itself. So, when you excite a tuning fork, there are these moments where if the frequency reaches a certain frequency, boop, it'll go up and it'll start vibrating at 880 hertz or, double of that or double of that or double of that or double of that. So thus, there's these degrees and thresholds of stability which deterritorialization acts upon. And then deterritorialization is always relative. That's important. It's always relative to the context and environment around it. And reterritorialization is the flip side. Any reterritorialization entails a deterritorialization somewhere else and vice versa. So if I deterritorialize some state apparatus, that is always going to entail reterritorializing that stuff somewhere else. So if I dismantle some government, that's necessarily going to entail establishing something new. And exactly what that is can depend, and that's an interesting political question to consider with regard to this text. But they really they don't want to idealize deterritorialization in the sense of making it this perfect thing, like making it their idol. They're like, look, reterritorialization is important and it's necessary. So if we do want to look at deterritorialization, which is essentially what is defining the positive motion of the assemblage, we have to look at its reterritorializations too. Now, critically here, they say every voyage is intensive and occurs in relation to thresholds of intensity between which it evolves or that it crosses. One travels by intensity. Displacements and spatial figures depend on intensive thresholds of nomadic deterritorialization and thus on differential relations that simultaneously define complementary sedentary reterritorializations. Every stratum operates this way, by grasping in its pincers a maximum number of intensities or intensive particles over which it spreads its forms and substances, constituting determinate gradients and thresholds of resonance. Deterritorialization on a stratum always occurs in relation to a complementary reterritorialization. And there's some stuff we've already went over there before, especially at the end with the complementary reterritorialization. But every voyage being intensive is really important because what they mean here by intensity is that every assemblage is pushed towards movement, and that movement is defined by gradients of intensities, which are defined by all the molecular components that make up the assemblage. And when they're talking about one traveling by intensity, they're merely saying that there are these thresholds that are passed, and thus, in response to differential relations, will create movement. And this will simultaneously define complementary sedentary reterritorializations, that as we move, we are always creating new places where territory can settle down. And of course, that's going to have a lot to do with their talk of nomadology. We can see a little bit of Heidegger's idea of pre-ontology coming back around when they say here on page 63 that content should be understood not simply as the hand and tools, but as a technical social machine that pre-exists them and constitutes states of force or formations of power. It's very Foucauldian in a sense, and obviously very Heideggerian, because the social machine pre-exists each of these individual objects. All these hands and tools and tables are all understood under the aegis of a technical social machine. This is kind of like when Judith Butler talks about not wanting to go back to pre-social ontology. She instead wants to vie for social ontology, whereby things are understood to their relations to other things, not abstracted away to some purpose or to some definite point of contact. Instead, they want to understand, think about, for example, Hubert Dreyfus uses this all the time when he's doing his Heidegger courses, that a hammer cannot exist without also nails and a whole industry and apparatus for creating the tools, and also houses to be built, materials to be used, existing houses that already exist, methods for using the hammers, schools for teaching you how to use the hammers. All of this comes together to define what it is to be a hammer. And thus, when we talk very naively about, like, for example, Aristotle loves in his Ethics and Politics to talk about the telos of objects, how things ought to be used. Ought is perhaps the wrong word, because all Aristotle can talk about is what is functionally best in the moment. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about too. They want to talk about, they don't want to talk about telos, but if they are using telos, it's in the same sense that Aristotle does, although Aristotle thinks he's getting at something kind of transcendently grounded in, like, this is how you ought to use people or flutes or whatever. But it's merely a sense of functionality, of how something fits into an environment. And thus, anything like a hammer or nails or houses already necessarily entails that it has been localized or defined in relationship to a machinic assemblage it is already in. It is defined by its pre-ontology. Coming back to linguistics here at the very end, I think it's always interesting to think about the idea of collective enunciation. And they bring this out a little bit to explain the functional roles of any partial object in an assemblage when they say, the collective assemblage is always like the murmur from which I take my proper name, the constellation of voices, concordant or not, from which I draw my voice. I always depend on a molecular assemblage of enunciation that is not given in my conscious mind any more than it depends solely on my apparent social determinations, which combine many heterogeneous regimes of signs, speaking in tongues. So to ever speak is to require being localized in a constellation of voices. We can think of this as a constellation of partial objects, as a constellation of molecular flows and multiplicities, all of which are giving you your voice. And this kind of relates to, in psychoanalysis, for example, when they talk about kind of what you really want, quote unquote, of how do we figure out that you really want mommy and daddy? And that's exactly how it is kind of cheekily phrased. That they start by deciding what it is that you already want. They're like, okay, these psychoanalysts, how is it that we can show these people that what they really want is the mommy and daddy? And the whole clinical practice is aimed around that, around taking these presuppositions and taking otherwise multiplicitous content in dreams and actions and behaviors and turning them into testaments to the fact that you want mommy and daddy or whatever, or that you want mommy and you want to kill daddy or whatever. Instead, Deleuze and Guattari want to say that your voice is not so much your voice, but rather it's your voice as a member of a collective assemblage of enunciation, which is to say that your voice is just as much a member of everyone else's voice. that what it is you say, think of it in the sense of what you mean by what you say, is entirely determined by a point in time in which you utter it, in the country you're in the predominant dialect there. Are you speaking a Creole language? What is kind of the culture that you're in? All of these are going to define what it is that is enunciated. And thus, you're always depending on this assemblage of enunciation that is not given by your mind, that's determined outside of your mind, and that you relate to as a member of this collective assemblage. And thus, realism for Deleuze and Guattari is just, it's just right there. You just have to be a realist who posits this world in order for assemblage theory to really work at all. When talking about linguistics, they're pushing back against this idea that everything can be reduced to a linguistic phenomenon. And they want to say that no, the difference between an affect and enunciating that affect is, well, enunciation is not the same as a feeling. These are different things, and they don't want us to reduce affects, experiences, senses, to something signified, something which you really meant through this kind of linguistic totalization. They say there is no use constructing a semantics or even recognizing a certain validity of pragmatics if they are still pre-treated by a phonological or syntactical machine, which is to say there's no use in constructing a language at all if we're still presupposing certain ways of how you ought to produce sounds, how you ought to relate certain things to one another in a language. For a true abstract machine pertains to an assemblage in its entirety. It is defined by the diagram of that assemblage. It is not language-based, but diagrammatic and superlinear. Content is not a signified nor expression of a signifier. Rather, both are variables of the assemblage. We get nowhere until the pragmatic, but also semantic, syntactical, and phonological determinations are directly linked to the assemblages of enunciation upon which they depend. Which is to say that any language, and we could think of this as just anything that is, any partial object that comes about, that any language is defined not only by its relationship to its perfect, quote-unquote, form, but also to its dialects and creoles and slang and stuff that makes it what it is as a variable in an assemblage. Think of this as English not being this obelisk of this is how perfect English is supposed to work, but rather English is, insofar as people speak it differently in the Bronx and in Canada and in Long Island and in Ireland and in Australia. Think of all the dramatic differences in pronunciation and ways of constructing sentences. Think of African American vernacular English, which commonly makes these grammatical differences in relation to standard English, which is often considered an inferior form of speech. But it's only an inferior form of speech if we presuppose that there is a perfect form of English and African American vernacular English is just a deficient form. Instead, African American vernacular English prescribes to its own grammatical rules and pronunciation rules, and they are consistent, and thus they can be seen as establishing their own territory. And thus it's interesting to consider how something like African American vernacular English, which is basically, I don't know how to put it in the least prejudiced way possible, but it's basically a form of English pioneered by African Americans. And, you can say, we do be going over there. And that is a legitimate form of grammatically correct speech in African American vernacular English. It's not in standard English, and the question is, well, if it gets the point across, what's wrong with it? So instead, it might be interesting to consider how something like African American vernacular English attests to some of the properties of the assemblage. There was a line of flight in which slaves who were being trafficked over to various English-speaking parts mixed their own languages with English to create creoles, or their pronunciation tendencies created new dialects, and thus the sprawl of English extended, but also English started to have its own languages that start to become mutually independent from one another. I mean, up in Appalachia, you can have some people that speak English that I would not even be able to begin to understand. There are some people down here in the South with very, very strong accents that someone from the UK might not understand. There are people with those really heavy Scottish accents that, people from a few blocks down can't understand. And thus, African American vernacular English is an interesting testament to the way in which a line of flight was followed, in which an assemblage was formed between different cultures, which created a new language, and which, if we consider English as this unitary system and there's a correct form of English, then you would necessarily view African American vernacular English as a deficient form of English. But if you think of it as a line of flight that has deterritorialized English and re-territorialized it into a new, interesting language, we might see it a little differently. So I hope this has given you some interesting things to think about with regards to assemblage theory, some of the basic constituents of, what exactly is an assemblage, how does it function, what are its basic principles of organization. So if you have any questions, of course, leave them in the comments, and check out my other Deleuze and Guattari lectures to get some more context on some of this, and I will see you in another lecture.